The morning air felt crisp and unforgiving as Sarah stood at the base of the Hamilton County Courthouse steps, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her daughter's pink dress for what must have been the 100th time that morning. The October sun cast long, dramatic shadows across the gleaming marble, creating patterns that seemed to shift and dance like her own anxious thoughts. Emma, her precious 3-year-old daughter, stood beside her holding a worn stuffed rabbit, completely oblivious to the magnitude of the day ahead. The little girl's copper curls caught the sunlight, creating an almost ethereal halo around her innocent face. Sarah knelt down slowly, her knees cracking slightly, a reminder of her own exhaustion from weeks of stress and sleepless nights. She looked directly into Emma's bright blue eyes, eyes that were so much like her own, yet held none of the burden and fear that currently weighed on Sarah's soul. "Remember what Mommy told you, sweetie?" Sarah asked gently, her voice wavering despite her best efforts to sound composed. "We're going to go inside that big building, and there are going to be a lot of grown-ups there. Some of them might look serious or sound mean, but that's just how they are at work. You're going to sit right next to Mommy the whole time, okay? And if you get scared or tired, you just squeeze Mommy's hand and I'll be right there with you." Emma nodded solemnly, though Sarah could tell her daughter didn't fully comprehend what was happening. How could she? Emma was only 3 years old. She should be worried about playground games and cartoon characters, not custody battles and courtroom testimony. Sarah kissed her daughter's forehead, lingering there for a moment longer than necessary, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo. She felt tears threatening to spill from her eyes but forced them back. She couldn't walk into that courtroom looking like she'd been crying. That's exactly what lawyers would use against her. They would paint her as emotionally unstable, unpredictable, unfit. The thought made her stomach churn with anxiety. The decision to bring Emma to court today had been controversial, to say the least. Sarah's lawyer, Chambers, was a sharp-tongued woman in her mid-50s who had built her reputation on defending mothers in impossible situations. Had argued passionately that Emma's presence would humanize Sarah's case, would demonstrate to Judge Mitchell her deep commitment to motherhood, and would create an emotional counterbalance to whatever lies team was planning to tell. "Judges are human beings," had said during their last consultation, her manicured finger pointing emphatically at Sarah across the mahogany desk. "And human beings respond to seeing a mother and child together. It reminds them why this matters. It reminds them that we're not just talking about custody percentages and financial arrangements. We're talking about a child's life, her future." But as Sarah stood here now, watching Emma play innocently with her rabbit, she couldn't shake the gnawing doubt that twisted in her gut. What if this backfired? What if the stress of being in that cold, intimidating courtroom traumatized Emma? What if attorneys used her presence against them, suggesting that Sarah was using her daughter as a prop, that she was exploiting Emma for sympathy? What if Emma had some kind of emotional breakdown during the proceedings? The what-ifs seemed endless, multiplying in Sarah's mind like bacteria in a petri dish. The past 18 months had been a nightmare of unprecedented proportions. Her marriage had deteriorated gradually at first, missed anniversaries, neglected conversations, growing emotional distance, but then suddenly and violently. He'd had an affair with a woman from his office, and when Sarah discovered the truth, everything had exploded. Had moved out, filed for divorce, and then, in a move that still shocked her, filed for primary custody of Emma. His lawyers had painted Sarah as unstable, claiming she had a drinking problem, which was patently false, suggesting she was emotionally unfit to be a primary caregiver. They cited minor incidents, a time when Sarah had been late picking Emma up from because of traffic, a weekend when she'd taken Emma to visit her sister and claimed the child looked unkempt. The allegations were ridiculous, but they stung. They made Sarah second-guess herself. Late at night, alone in her apartment with Emma sleeping in her room, Sarah would lie awake thinking about every parenting decision she'd made. Was she doing enough? Was she doing it right? Had she failed her daughter in some way that she wasn't even aware of? Her parents had been supportive but worried. Her mother had wanted her to hire an expensive custody evaluator, someone who could conduct home visits and interview Emma. But Sarah couldn't afford it. She was already drowning in legal bills. Her father had simply held her while she cried, not saying much because there wasn't much to say. Her brother had offered to come to the courthouse today, but Sarah had declined. She needed to face this alone with only Emma for support. Had been her rock through all of this, a warrior in a pantsuit who genuinely seemed to care about Sarah's case beyond the billable hours. It was who had suggested bringing Emma to court. At first, Sarah had been horrified at the idea, but as had explained the strategy, it began to make a strange kind of sense. Emma's presence would be a silent testimony, a living, breathing reminder that this custody case wasn't abstract legal maneuvering, but rather a decision that would profoundly affect a real child's life. As they stood at the courthouse steps now, Sarah took a deep breath and squeezed Emma's small hand. Her daughter's fingers were so tiny, so delicate. Emma looked up at her with complete trust, completely dependent on her mother to navigate this confusing and frightening situation. That trust was both comforting and terrifying. Sarah thought about what she was fighting for, not just custody percentages or legal victories, but Emma's sense of security, her her knowledge that her mother loved her and would always fight for her. "Okay, baby," Sarah said, managing a weak smile. "Let's go inside. Remember, we're brave, right? We're the girls and we stick together." "We stick together," Emma repeated solemnly, still not fully understanding but drawing strength from her mother's words anyway. Together they climbed the courthouse steps, their hands intertwined. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest like a wild animal trying to escape its cage. Behind them, the October sun continued its arc across the sky, indifferent to the human drama about to unfold. Ahead of them, the imposing courthouse doors loomed like the entrance to some unknown destiny. Sarah took one more deep breath, gathered all her courage, and walked forward. Whatever happened in that courtroom today would change their lives forever. She just hoped, desperately, achingly hoped, that she was making the right decision. As they crossed the threshold into the building, Sarah whispered another silent prayer. She prayed that Emma would be brave. She prayed that the judge would see the truth. She prayed that justice would prevail. And most of all, she prayed that this gamble would save her family. The courtroom doors swung shut behind Sarah and Emma with a heavy, decisive click that seemed to echo through Sarah's bones. Immediately, Emma's small hand tightened around her mother's fingers, her head craning back to take in the sheer scale of the space before them. The courtroom was cavernous and imposing, designed, Sarah realized, to make ordinary people feel small and intimidated. Soaring ceilings stretched at least 20 feet overhead, decorated with intricate crown molding that looked like it belonged in a palace rather than a courthouse. The walls were lined with dark mahogany wood that appeared to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating an atmosphere of solemnity and gravitas that seemed to press down on the room like a physical weight. Rows of wooden benches stretched behind them, the gallery where observers and family members sat during proceedings. But at this early morning hour, the benches were nearly empty. Ahead of them, separated by a low wooden partition, was the business section of the courtroom. 2 large tables faced the judge's bench, one for the plaintiff's attorney and one for the defendant's. Papers were already scattered across both tables in organized but voluminous piles. Behind these tables sat various court personnel, a court reporter, a bailiff in an official uniform, a clerk shuffling through documents with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times. And presiding over it all, elevated on a massive bench of dark wood that looked like a throne, sat Judge Mitchell. She was a striking woman in her early 60s with silver hair cut in a severe bob, piercing gray eyes that seemed to see everything, and an expression that suggested she had witnessed every possible permutation of human conflict and found most of it tedious. She wore her black judicial robes with the kind of authority that came from nearly 3 decades of presiding over courtrooms. Her reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck, and her hands were folded precisely in front of her as she reviewed documents. Even sitting completely still, Judge Mitchell radiated a palpable sense of power and control. Sarah felt her anxiety spike another notch. A court officer, a large man with a stern face, gestured for them to move toward the gallery section. Sarah guided Emma to the front row of the benches, directly behind where the attorneys would be sitting. This positioning had been strategic, discussed extensively with. They wanted Emma visible to the judge but not so prominent as to seem exploitative. Sarah sat down first, and Emma climbed up beside her, her small legs dangling several inches above the floor. The little girl swung her feet rhythmically, the only sound a soft, irregular tapping against the wooden bench. Sarah placed a gentle hand on Emma's leg, not to stop the motion. The movement seemed to soothe her daughter, but simply to maintain contact, to remind Emma that her mother was right there. The courtroom's air conditioning was set to Arctic levels, and Sarah could feel goosebumps rising on her arms despite the light sweater she'd worn under her blazer. The cold, sterile environment felt deliberately designed to strip away warmth and humanity. She reached over and pulled Emma's cardigan around the little girl's shoulders, making sure her daughter was warm enough. Chambers entered through a side door, moving with the brisk, purposeful stride of someone who was completely at home in this environment. She wore a navy suit with a crisp white blouse, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. She spotted Sarah and Emma and gave them an almost imperceptible nod, a gesture meant to be reassuring but that somehow had the opposite effect on Sarah. It felt like a signal. Here we go. This is really happening now. On the opposite side of the room, Saturni entered next, a tall man named Richard who had the aggressive demeanor of someone who enjoyed courtroom combat. He was followed moments later by himself. Sarah's ex-husband looked handsome in his charcoal suit, his dark hair perfectly styled, his expression composed and confident. He didn't even glance in Sarah's direction, which somehow made the snub even more painful. Emma, however, spotted him immediately. "Daddy," she called out, her voice bright and cheerful, rising above the careful silence of the courtroom. Several people turned to look. Sarah felt her face flush with embarrassment and quickly placed a finger to her lips, whispering urgently, "Quiet, baby. We have to be quiet in here, remember." Emma's smile faded, confused by her mother's sudden sternness. She turned back to look at her father, but he was already looking away, pretending he hadn't heard. The rejection, though Emma likely wouldn't understand its significance, cut Sarah like a knife. This was what was capable of coldness, dismissal, of emotional distance. Judge Mitchell looked up from her documents at the sound of Emma's voice. Her gray eyes moved from the little girl to Sarah, and something flickered across her expression, something that might have been disapproval or might have been curiosity. Sarah couldn't quite read it. The proceedings began with the judge reviewing the case file, her voice monotone and professional as she outlined the custody dispute in its broadest terms. She explained that they would be hearing arguments today regarding primary custody, visitation schedules, and child support. "This court takes very seriously the of the minor child in question," she intoned, and for a moment those gray eyes rested directly on Emma. As the attorneys began their opening statements, the testimony became increasingly technical and legalistic. Richard started first, outlining his case with the precision of someone well-versed in courtroom strategy. He spoke about financial stability, about his established home, about his professional success. He painted a picture of a responsible father being prevented from full participation in his daughter's life by an unstable ex-partner. Sarah listened with growing dread, knowing that every word was designed to undermine her credibility, to make her seem like an obstacle rather than an asset to Emma's. The hours began to blur together, countered with her own opening arguments, speaking passionately about the bond between mother and child, about continuity of care, about Emma's needs and attachment to her mother. But her words, however eloquent, seemed to float above the courtroom like hot air balloons, unable to anchor themselves in the cold, procedural reality of the legal process. Emma's attention span, which had briefly perked up at the sight of her father, began to fade. She shifted restlessly in her seat, her legs swinging faster and faster. Sarah pulled her stuffed rabbit from her small backpack and let Emma hold it, whispering that she could listen to the rabbit's heartbeat while the grown-ups talked. Emma seemed marginally more content with this distraction, but her yawns became more frequent as the morning wore on. It was around 10:45 a.m., nearly 90 minutes into the proceedings, that something extraordinary happened. The courtroom door opened, and the energy in the room seemed to shift palpably. Officer James entered, and beside him walked K9 Max, a magnificent German shepherd whose golden-brown coat gleamed under the fluorescent courtroom lights. The dog's bearing was regal, his movements precise and controlled, his intelligent eyes alert and aware of his surroundings. He was beautiful in a way that transcended the purely physical. There was something noble about him, something that commanded attention and respect. Emma's head snapped up as if she'd been struck by lightning. Her eyes widened to enormous circles, her fatigue evaporating in a single moment. The stuffed rabbit fell forgotten from her hands. She pointed directly at the dog, her entire body suddenly vibrant with excitement. "Doggy," she breathed, her small voice filled with wonder and delight. "Mommy, look, big doggy." The moment K9 Max entered the courtroom, it was as if a spell had been cast over the entire room. The dog moved with an almost ceremonial grace, his muscular frame perfectly proportioned, each paw step deliberate and controlled. Officer James held the leash with a light, confident hand, guiding his partner with the ease of someone who had worked with this animal for countless hours. The German shepherd's coat shimmered under the harsh fluorescent lights, the golden-brown fur catching the light in a way that made him seem almost luminous. But it was his eyes, dark, intelligent, aware, that truly captivated everyone present. These were not the eyes of a simple animal, but rather the eyes of a being with purpose, training, and an almost human-like understanding of his role. Emma's reaction was instantaneous and visceral. Her entire body went rigid, every muscle tensing with excitement. Her mouth fell open in a perfect O of astonishment, and for a moment she seemed unable to breathe. Her eyes didn't blink, didn't waver, didn't shift away from the dog for even a fraction of a second. It was as if K9 Max had become the only thing that existed in the universe, and everything else, the judge, the attorneys, the formal proceedings, even her mother sitting right beside her, had faded into complete insignificance. "Doggy," Emma whispered, her voice filled with reverence usually reserved for prayer or spiritual experience. "Mommy, look, mommy, big doggy." Her tiny hand rose slowly, her index finger extending toward the dog in an almost worshipful gesture. "Big, big doggy." Sarah felt something shift in her own chest as she watched her daughter's response. She squeezed Emma's other hand gently, acutely aware that every person in the courtroom was now watching not the dog, but the little girl. The atmosphere had fundamentally changed. Where moments before there had been tension, hostility, and legal maneuvering, now there was something simpler and more profound, a child's pure, uncomplicated joy at witnessing something beautiful. Officer guided K9 Max to a designated area in the back corner of the courtroom, a space that had been specifically prepared for the dog's comfort. A thick, cushioned bed lay on the floor, and beside it sat a water bowl. The court staff had clearly anticipated this arrangement and settled Max onto the bed with a simple command. The dog obediently lay down, his body curling into a comfortable position, though his alert eyes remained open and aware. His ears perked forward slightly, continuing to monitor the room even as his body relaxed into repose. But Emma couldn't stop staring. Her eyes remained locked onto K9 Max with the kind of focused intensity that children possess when they encounter something that captures their imagination completely. She shifted in her seat, her body angling toward the dog, her head craning around to maintain visual contact, even as Sarah's hand on her arm tried gently to redirect her attention back to the proceedings. "Mommy, why doggy here?" Emma asked, Her voice carried across the quiet courtroom with the characteristic lack of volume control that young children possessed. "Doggy come to court. Doggy work here." Several attorneys and court personnel exchanged glances. Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks, suddenly self-conscious about Emma's questions. But before she could formulate a whispered response, the court clerk leaned over from her desk and mouthed silently, "Comfort Animal Program." Judge Mitchell's reaction was subtle but noticeable. Sarah watched as the stern expression on the judge's face softened, almost imperceptibly. The gray eyes, which had been cold and penetrating just moments before, seemed to warm slightly as they observed Emma's undivided fascination with the dog. The judge made a small notation on the legal pad in front of her, her pen moving across the paper in quick strokes. Sarah couldn't read what was written, but something about that notation felt significant, as if the judge was documenting something more important than the legal arguments being presented. Emma's pointing finger remained extended, and her small body vibrated with barely contained excitement. "Doggy so pretty, Mommy. Doggy so pretty. Can I pet Doggy? Can I say hi to Doggy?" The questions tumbled out in rapid succession, each one filled with genuine wonder and innocent hope. "Baby," Sarah whispered, placing a gentle finger against her daughter's lips, "we have to be quiet and respectful in here. The doggy is working just like all the other people, but we can look at the doggy. That's okay." Emma seemed satisfied with this explanation. She settled back into her seat but never stopped looking at K9 Max. Every few seconds her pointing finger would rise again, her lips moving silently as she continued her fascinated commentary about the beautiful dog. "Doggy's ears so pointy, Doggy's fur so soft, Doggy's nose so big and wet. Does Doggy like the court? Is Doggy scared?" Sarah found herself smiling despite the enormity of the situation, despite the legal battle raging around them, despite all the fear and uncertainty that had consumed her for the past 18 months. There was something profoundly healing about watching her daughter experience pure, unadulterated joy. In this moment, Emma wasn't a pawn in a custody battle. She wasn't caught in the middle of her parents' conflict. She was simply a 3-year-old girl who had encountered something wonderful, and nothing else mattered to her. The energy shift in the courtroom was palpable and undeniable. Where tension had dominated the atmosphere just minutes before, there was now a kind of gentleness, an acknowledgement that something sacred was occurring. The presence of a child experiencing wonder even seemed affected by it. Sarah noticed her ex-husband's posture shift, his confident demeanor faltering for just a moment as he observed his daughter's joy. She wondered if he was remembering who Emma really was when all the legal arguments and custody percentages were stripped away. A little girl who just wanted to see a pretty dog. Richard's attorney seemed less moved by the moment. He shifted papers impatiently on his desk, clearing his throat as if to redirect attention back to the legal proceedings. But Judge Mitchell held up a hand, her eyes still on Emma and K9 Max. "The record will reflect," Judge Mitchell said, her voice carrying a tone that was distinctly different from her previous judicial pronouncements, warmer, somehow more human, that the Comfort Animal Program is serving its intended purpose. Sarah's attorney reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand. Sarah realized that her lawyer was smiling, and there was something in that smile that suggested believed something important had just happened. Something that couldn't be captured in legal transcripts or argued in closing statements, but something that every person present could feel. The courtroom proceeded with its testimony, but the energy had been fundamentally altered. Emma remained fixated on K9 Max, but she was no longer restless or bored. She was content to sit quietly, occasionally whispering observations about the dog to her mother. And whenever Judge Mitchell looked up from her documents, which was frequently, her gaze seemed to rest first on Emma, then on K9 Max, as if she was observing something far more important than the technical details of custody law. In that moment, though Sarah didn't fully understand it yet, the course of the entire proceeding had shifted. The introduction of one dog had changed the courtroom into something more humane, more connected to the actual stakes involved, the of a child. And that subtle change would prove to be the most significant turning point in the entire case. The morning had progressed into early afternoon, the sun's position visible through the high windows of the courtroom shifting its angle incrementally. Sarah's back ached from sitting on the rigid wooden bench, and her throat felt dry from the courthouse's aggressive air conditioning. Emma had dozed off for approximately 20 minutes earlier, her head resting against her mother's shoulder, exhausted by the combination of stress and the mind-numbing drone of legal arguments. But she had awakened about 30 minutes ago, and her attention had immediately returned to K9 Max, who remained peacefully resting on his cushioned bed in the back corner of the courtroom. The testimony had been proceeding predictably. Sarah's lawyer had presented evidence of her financial stability, character references, and documentation of her consistent involvement in Emma's medical appointments, school activities, and daily care. It was all technical and somewhat tedious, the kind of procedural evidence that was necessary but uninspiring. Judge Mitchell had listened with her usual impassive expression, taking occasional notes, asking clarifying questions when needed. The courtroom had settled into a kind of rhythm, and for a moment, Sarah had allowed herself to relax just slightly, to believe that perhaps the worst was behind them. Then Richard stood up. Saturni was a man in his late 50s with slick-back gray hair, an expensive suit that cost more than Sarah made in a month, and the kind of predatory confidence that came from years of courtroom victories. He moved with theatrical precision, addressing the judge with elaborate courtesy. "Your Honor, if I may call our next witness to establish the plaintiff's case regarding the defendant's fitness as a primary caregiver." Judge Mitchell nodded. "Proceed." "The plaintiff calls David Foster to the stand." Sarah's stomach dropped. She knew David Foster, or rather she had known him years ago when they'd both worked at Prescott Financial Services. They'd been colleagues, nothing more. They'd exchanged pleasantries in the break room, attended the same team meetings, but had never developed any kind of close relationship. She hadn't seen him in nearly 4 years, not since she'd left that job to stay home with Emma after her birth. David Foster entered the courtroom with the swagger of someone who believed himself to be supremely important. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with slick-back dark hair, and the kind of artificially tanned skin that suggested frequent visits to a tanning salon. He wore an expensive charcoal suit and carried himself with the confidence of someone completely comfortable with his own importance. He smiled at various people as he walked toward the witness stand, clearly enjoying the attention. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Something about his demeanor was off, rehearsed, theatrical. Foster was sworn in, and after some preliminary questioning about his background and his knowledge of Sarah, Richard began his examination in earnest. "Mr. Foster, during the time you worked with the defendant, did you observe anything that concerned you about her behavior or her mental state?" "Oh, absolutely," Foster said immediately, his voice carrying a tone of false concern. "Sarah was often erratic, emotional. I witnessed her having what I would describe as mood swings. One minute she'd be fine, the next minute she'd be crying or defensive. I always worried about her stability." Sarah felt her attorney's hand find her own, squeezing it in a gesture that meant, "Stay calm, don't react." But Foster wasn't finished. "And after she left the company to have her baby, I ran into her at a grocery store once. She looked disheveled. Her hair wasn't brushed, and the child, Emma, I assume, was wearing mismatched clothing. I remember thinking that Sarah seemed overwhelmed, like she couldn't handle being a mother." The lies accumulated like debris in a flood. Foster spoke with such confidence, such apparent sincerity, that Sarah could see some of the court personnel beginning to nod slightly, as if his accusations were resonating as truth. He described incidents that never happened, Sarah supposedly being unable to remember work details, being dismissive of colleagues, showing signs of substance abuse. He painted a picture of an unstable, unreliable woman who was clearly unfit to be Emma's primary caregiver. "In your professional opinion, Mr. Foster," Richard asked, his voice dripping with manufactured gravitas, "do you believe the defendant is emotionally capable of providing the stable, consistent care that a young child requires?" "I honestly don't," Foster said, shaking his head with theatrical sadness. "I worry about that little girl. I think she deserves a father who can provide stability." Sarah felt rage building in her chest like a physical pressure. Every word was a fabrication. The grocery store incident he described had never happened. She had never been erratic or emotionally unstable at work. And most insidiously, he was using her appearance and her status as a single mother against her, suggesting that simply being overwhelmed by motherhood was evidence of unfitness. Stood up to cross-examine, her voice sharp and commanding. But Foster was slippery, defensive without appearing defensive, always managing to reframe questions in ways that supported his narrative. He was clearly being paid well for this performance. Sarah could read it in the confidence of his body language, the way he anticipated the attorney's questions, the rehearsed quality of his responses. It was in the middle of his response to his question about specific dates and incidents, moments when Foster was becoming increasingly animated and aggressive in his testimony, his voice rising, his gestures becoming more emphatic, that it happened. Emma, who had been watching everything with the innocent curiosity of a 3-year-old, suddenly became very still. Her body went rigid. Her eyes, which had been darting between the various speakers as she tried to follow the conversation she didn't understand, suddenly locked onto David Foster with laser-focused intensity. Her small hand rose slowly, her index finger extending with deliberate purpose. "No," Emma shouted, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a bell. "No, doggy, no." Sarah's heart stopped. The entire courtroom seemed to freeze in that moment. Emma's pointing finger pivoted from Foster to the back corner of the room where K9 Max lay resting. "Doggy no bad man," she declared with absolute certainty, as if she possessed some fundamental truth that only she could perceive. "Doggy no." Then her finger swung back to Foster, her small face scrunched up with an emotion that Sarah immediately recognized as fear, genuine, primal, instinctive fear. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Several attorneys began speaking at once. Richard jumped to his feet with an expression of outrage, looked stunned, his confident demeanor cracking visibly. Foster himself had gone pale, his hands gripping the witness stand with white-knuckled intensity. Judge Mitchell banged her gavel once, a sharp, authoritative sound that commanded absolute silence. "Order! I will have order in this courtroom." Sarah immediately pulled Emma back into her seat, wrapping her arms around her daughter, whispering apologies and reassurances. But something extraordinary was happening in the courtroom. Sarah could feel it in the shift of energy, see it in the expressions of the court personnel, notice it in the way Judge Mitchell's eyes had narrowed with intense focus. K9 Max, who had been peacefully resting moments before, had responded to Emma's distress and to Foster's escalating emotional state. The dog's ears had perked forward sharply, and his body had tensed. Officer's hand moved instinctively to the dog's collar, and Sarah could see the officer's expression had transformed. He was no longer a bystander, but rather someone who had just witnessed something significant. Judge Mitchell leaned forward, her gray eyes moving between Emma, K9 Max, and Foster with the intensity of someone who had just perceived a crucial piece of evidence that existed beyond the realm of legal testimony. "We will take a 15-minute recess," Judge Mitchell announced, her voice carrying an undertone of urgency and barely concealed interest. "All parties remain available in their respective locations. Officer, please remain with K9 Max." As the bailiff ushered people from their positions, Sarah held Emma tightly, her daughter still trembling slightly. still pointing occasionally at Foster with an expression that conveyed absolute conviction that she had perceived something dangerous. Something fundamental had shifted. The course of the entire proceeding had fundamentally altered in the span of perhaps 5 seconds. The 15-minute recess had barely begun when the courtroom doors closed behind the various attorneys, court personnel, and observers who had filed out in confused clusters. The murmuring voices that drifted back through the doors suggested that people were already speculating wildly about what Emma had meant, what had prompted her outburst, and what it could possibly signify in the context of the custody hearing. Sarah remained in the courtroom with Emma, as she had been instructed, sitting in the front bench with her daughter pressed tightly against her side. Emma had finally stopped pointing and trembling, but her small body remained rigid with tension, and occasionally she would glance back toward the witness stand where David Foster had been sitting, her eyes widening slightly as if expecting him to suddenly reappear. Sarah ran her fingers through Emma's copper curls, trying to soothe her daughter despite her own racing thoughts and thundering heartbeat. She whispered reassurances, "It's okay, baby. You're safe. Mommy's right here," but she was speaking partly to comfort herself as well. What had Emma seen? What had she perceived that had triggered such a visceral, almost primal reaction? Sarah had never seen her daughter act this way before. Emma was generally a cheerful, easygoing child, quick to smile, slow to anger. This intensity was unprecedented. Officer James remained in the courtroom as well, as he had been instructed by Judge Mitchell. He sat on a bench toward the back of the room, his hand resting gently on K9 Max's head. The dog had calmed considerably since Emma's outburst, his body relaxed back into its comfortable resting position on the cushioned bed. But's own demeanor had transformed entirely. Where he had previously seemed like a peripheral figure, simply present to facilitate the comfort animal program, he now appeared laser-focused, his eyes moving between Sarah, Emma, and the witness stand, his expression contemplative and deeply serious. The silence in the courtroom was almost suffocating. Sarah could hear the hum of the air conditioning system, the distant sound of footsteps in the hallway outside, the quiet breathing of Officer and K9 Max across the room. She wondered what was happening in Judge Mitchell's chambers at that moment. Were the attorneys arguing about what had just occurred? Was the judge conferring with her law clerk? Was she reviewing case law to determine the relevance of a 3-year-old seemingly random outburst? After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 minutes, the courtroom door opened. Officer stood up immediately, alert and ready. Judge Mitchell's clerk gestured for Officer to follow him, presumably to Judge Mitchell's chambers. As stood, K9 Max rose as well, attuned to his partner's movements with the kind of synchronization that came only from extensive training and deep partnership. Sarah watched as they departed, wondering what role the officer and the dog would play in whatever was happening behind closed judicial doors. She pulled Emma closer, and her daughter nestled against her, finally beginning to show signs of the exhaustion that such intense emotional turmoil would naturally produce. Minutes passed. Sarah found herself studying Emma's face, searching for clues about what her daughter had perceived. There was nothing remarkable about her expression now, just the peaceful, innocent face of a tired 3-year-old. Sarah tried to reconstruct the moment. Emma had been watching Foster intently as he grew increasingly animated, increasingly aggressive in his testimony. The dog had been calm, peaceful. Then Emma had suddenly reacted as if she'd witnessed something dangerous or threatening. Could children sense danger the way animals did? Sarah had read somewhere about studies suggesting that young children possessed intuitive abilities that adults often lost through conditioning and rationalization. Could Emma have perceived something in Foster's behavior, some aggressive posturing or predatory energy, that the adults in the courtroom had filtered through their intellectual, legal frameworks and therefore missed? Or was it simpler than that? Could Emma have simply recognized that the man on the witness stand was saying things that hurt her mommy? Could she have intuited in the way that children did that this man was a threat to her and her mother? The courtroom door opened again. Officer returned, K9 Max padding quietly beside him, but his expression had changed again. Where it had been contemplative, it now appeared grave, serious, and laden with significance. He made eye contact with Sarah briefly, just for a moment, and in that glance she saw something that gave her a fragile spark of hope. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but it was there. The look of someone who had just learned something crucial, something that changed the entire trajectory of what was happening. Judge Mitchell emerged several minutes later, her expression even more inscrutable than usual. She took her position on the bench, surveying the courtroom with those penetrating gray eyes. "We will continue in session," she announced. "Officer, I have a question for you, if you would please approach the bench." What followed was a quiet conversation between the judge, officer, and both attorneys, conducted at a volume that Sarah couldn't quite hear from her position in the gallery. She watched his lips move, watched his hand gesture occasionally toward K9 Max, watched the judge's expression grow more focused and intense as she listened. The conversation lasted perhaps 5 minutes. Then Judge Mitchell nodded, and officer returned to his position. Richard looked visibly agitated, his earlier confidence replaced with something that looked disturbingly like anxiety. By contrast, appeared cautiously optimistic, though she was carefully maintaining a neutral expression. "Let the record show," Judge Mitchell announced, speaking directly into the courtroom record, "that K9 Max, a trained comfort animal with specialized certification in recognizing aggressive and hostile behavioral patterns, exhibited a clear alert response during the testimony of Mr. David Foster. The alert occurred immediately preceding the outburst of the minor child in question." Sarah's breath caught in her chest. Was the judge suggesting that the dog's reaction somehow validated Emma's instinctive response? Judge Mitchell continued, her voice carrying the weight of significant legal pronouncement. "While the alert response of a canine comfort animal does not constitute admissible evidence in the legal sense, it does warrant further investigation into the credibility and background of the witness in question. The court is therefore ordering an immediate, comprehensive investigation into Mr. Foster's history, employment record, and any prior incidents of aggressive or threatening behavior." She turned her gaze directly toward Richard, and, "Additionally, this court is concerned about potential witness tampering or coaching. Mr. I am requesting that you provide documentation regarding your arrangement with Mr. Foster, including any compensation or inducements offered in exchange for his testimony." The courtroom erupted, not in the uncontrolled chaos of before, but in shocked whispers and urgent movement. Richard was on his feet, objecting, demanding to know on what basis the judge was questioning his professional conduct. But Judge Mitchell's gavel came down once, twice, 3 times, each strike deliberate and commanding. "Order," she declared, her voice like steel. "This court will not tolerate further disruption. We are taking a recess until 2 p.m. At that time, Mr. You will provide the requested documentation, or I will hold you in contempt." As the bailiff began ushering people from the courtroom again, Sarah felt something shift fundamentally within her. Officer gave her another glance as he and K9 Max departed, and this time she was almost certain she saw a slight nod, a gesture that seemed to communicate, "Your daughter knows the truth, and now we're going to prove it." Sarah pulled Emma close, tears finally beginning to stream down her face. Not tears of despair this time, but tears of cautious, fragile hope. Whatever was happening, whatever had transpired in Judge Mitchell's chambers, Emma's instinctive cry had set something into motion. The machinery of justice, which had seemed so stacked against Sarah just minutes before, was now grinding forward in a different direction. K9 Max had seen what Emma had perceived. And sometimes, Sarah thought, the truth speaks through the most unexpected voices. A dog's alert response, a child's instinctive cry, a judge's willingness to look beyond conventional legal procedure to find actual justice. Judge Mitchell's chambers were a study in judicial authority and meticulous organization. Dark wood paneling covered 3 walls, lined with leather-bound volumes of case law and legal precedent. The 4th wall was dominated by windows that overlooked the city, providing a sweeping vista of the urban landscape below. The judge's desk was massive and immaculate, with documents arranged in perfectly aligned stacks and a computer monitor positioned at an exact angle. Photographs on the wall showed Judge Mitchell in various poses, receiving commendations, speaking at conferences, posing with her adult children. The overall impression was of a woman who had dedicated her life to the law and demanded the same level of precision and commitment from everyone around her. Judge Mitchell sat behind her desk, flanked by her law clerk, a sharp young woman named Jennifer Park who specialized in family law. Across from them sat Officer James, who had brought K9 Max into the chambers with the permission of the judge. The dog remained calm and alert beside his handler, seemingly aware of the gravity of the situation despite the informal setting. Officer, Judge Mitchell began, her voice carrying its characteristic tone of measured authority. I need you to explain what just occurred in my courtroom, and I need the complete truth, not a sanitized version. Took a breath, clearly choosing his words carefully. Your Honor, K9 Max has been trained to recognize aggressive behavioral patterns and hostile intent. He's certified in threat detection and has extensive training in identifying when individuals are displaying predatory or dangerous behavioral cues. When Mr. Foster was testifying, particularly as he became more animated and aggressive, Max alerted. Alerted, Judge Mitchell repeated, leaning back in her chair. Can you be more specific? His ears perked forward, indicating heightened alert status. His body tensed. He vocalized, a low, questioning sound. These are all signs that he's perceived something we consider a threat or dangerous behavioral pattern. I've worked with Max for 7 years, Your Honor. I know his alerts. This was a genuine alert response, not random behavior. Jennifer Park was taking detailed notes, her pen moving across the legal pad in rapid, precise strokes. Judge Mitchell tapped her fingers once on her desk, a gesture that seemed to indicate she was processing information and formulating her next thought. And the child's outburst, the judge continued. What's your assessment of that? Hesitated, clearly considering the implications of what he was about to say. Your Honor, I don't want to overstep my professional expertise, but based on what I observed, the child seemed to be reacting to something she perceived in Mr. Foster's demeanor. The simultaneous alert from K9 Max suggests that both the child and the dog were responding to genuine behavioral cues that indicated something disturbing about that man. Judge Mitchell nodded slowly. Officer, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer truthfully. Have you had any prior interaction with Mr. Foster? His expression changed immediately. His jaw tightened, and he took a moment before responding. Yes, Your Honor. Approximately 3 weeks ago, I was conducting community outreach at Riverside Shopping Center. K9 Max and I were present as part of a public safety initiative. An altercation occurred in the parking lot. Tell me about this altercation, Judge Mitchell commanded, her eyes narrowing with interest. Mr. Foster became involved in a dispute with another individual over a parking space. The situation escalated quickly. Foster's behavior became increasingly aggressive. He raised his voice, made threatening gestures, and at one point he grabbed my arm with considerable force. He was displaying what I would characterize as predatory aggression, not just anger, but a deliberate attempt at intimidation and control. Jennifer Park's pen was moving even faster now, capturing every detail. K9 Max alerted immediately, continued. I de-escalated the situation, and the incident was documented in the police report filed that day. I have the report number if you'd like to access it, Your Honor. Judge Mitchell made a note. I want that report pulled immediately, Jennifer, and I want you to access all of Mr. Foster's employment records, any prior legal incidents, any complaints filed against him. She turned back to Officer. "One more question. The child Emma, was she present at this parking lot incident?" Nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. She was with her mother, Sarah. She appeared to be present during the entire altercation." The implications hung in the air like a visible thing. A 3-year-old had witnessed an aggressive confrontation involving David Foster and a police dog. That same police dog had alerted to Foster's aggressive behavior. Now, months later, that same child had inexplicably recognized something dangerous in Foster during his courtroom testimony, while simultaneously the dog had responded the same way it had responded to his previous aggressive behavior. It was beginning to look less like coincidence and more like pattern recognition, whether conscious or unconscious. Judge Mitchell stood up, moving to the windows and gazing out at the city below. She remained silent for nearly a minute, her hands clasped behind her back. When she turned back to face, her expression was resolute and determined. "Officer, I'm going to make a judicial order. I want a comprehensive investigation into David Foster's background, employment history, any incidents of aggressive behavior, any complaints or lawsuits involving him. I want his financial records, specifically any payments received in relation to this case, and I want it done today if possible." She returned to her desk and began typing on her computer, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "Jennifer, contact the Detective Bureau. Request that they conduct an expedited background investigation. Make it clear this is for an active case and priority status is justified." Then, addressing Officer directly, "Your dog's instincts may have just exposed a fraud of significant proportions. I'm going to need you to testify about what happened 3 weeks ago at that shopping center and about what you observed in my courtroom today. Are you willing to do that?" "Of course, Your Honor," responded immediately. Over the next several hours, the machinery of justice shifted into overdrive. Detectives began pulling David Foster's employment records. What they found was deeply disturbing. Foster had been terminated from 3 different jobs in the past 5 years, each time for aggressive behavior toward colleagues, each time with settlements that included non-disclosure agreements. He had filed and lost multiple lawsuits for wrongful termination, claiming that his dismissals were unfair and based on personal vendetta. More concerning, investigators discovered evidence of a pattern of manipulation and intimidation. Foster had a documented history of ingratiating himself into situations, gathering information about people's vulnerabilities, and then weaponizing that information. Several women had reported that he had made inappropriate advances, becoming aggressive and hostile when rejected. One incident had resulted in a restraining order that Foster had violated twice. Most damning of all, the investigators found evidence of financial fraud. Foster had received a payment of $5,000 from his personal account just 2 weeks before the custody hearing. When confronted with this evidence, his banker provided additional information. There had been communications between his attorney and Foster prior to the payment, suggesting that compensation had been arranged. Additionally, investigators discovered that Foster had actually seen Sarah quite recently, just 1 month prior to the current custody hearing, at a restaurant where he had deliberately positioned himself to encounter her. Sarah had documented the interaction in her personal journal, noting that Foster's behavior had been strange and uncomfortable, that he had asked her invasive questions about her parenting and her current financial situation. She had felt unsettled by the encounter, but had thought it was simply an awkward coincidence. It wasn't a coincidence at all. It was evidence of coordination between and Foster to gather ammunition for the custody case. When Judge Mitchell reviewed these findings, her expression hardened into something cold and determined. She made several calls to her administrative staff, requesting expedited hearing procedures and scheduling additional court time for the afternoon session. Before reconvening in open court, Judge Mitchell called both attorneys into her chambers once more. She presented the investigation findings with clinical precision, laying out the evidence of Foster's pattern of aggressive behavior, his financial compensation from, and his documented history of manipulation and fraud. Richard's face went pale. He immediately attempted to distance from Foster's misconduct, claiming he had no knowledge of the inappropriate payment or the previous incidents in Foster's history. But Judge Mitchell was unimpressed. Your professional responsibility as an officer of the court includes vetting your witnesses, she said coldly. A cursory background check would have revealed Mr. Foster's history. The fact that you failed to do so, or that you deliberately ignored evidence of his unsuitability, suggests either gross negligence or deliberate misconduct. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. I am considering referring you to the State Bar Association for investigation. I am also considering sanctions against your client for knowingly presenting false evidence and potentially engaging in perjury. Sarah's attorney sat silently, allowing the magnitude of the situation to unfold. She didn't need to say anything. The evidence was speaking for itself. Justice, it seemed, did have a voice, and it spoke through the interconnected perceptions of a dog and a child, through the diligent work of investigators, and through the unwavering commitment of a judge to find the truth. The courtroom at 2 p.m. had a fundamentally different energy than it had possessed that morning. The room seemed to hum with tension and anticipation, as if every molecule of air had been charged with electricity. News of the investigation findings had somehow leaked, Sarah suspected through loose-tongued court staff, and there was an undercurrent of knowing speculation among the various observers who had returned to witness the afternoon proceedings. Judge Mitchell entered with a demeanor that was noticeably different from her morning composure. Where she had been merely stern, she was now coldly furious, her movements precise and controlled in the way of someone barely containing righteous anger. Sarah sat in the front bench with Emma nestled against her side. Her daughter was pale and slightly feverish from the emotional exhaustion of the morning's events. Sarah had taken her to the bathroom during the recess and had encouraged her to drink water and rest her head against her mother's shoulder. Emma's stuffed rabbit lay in Sarah's lap, and she occasionally reached down to stroke its worn fabric, seeking comfort in the familiar object. Judge Mitchell took her position on the bench and surveyed the courtroom with eyes that seemed to burn with intensity. "Let the record reflect," she began, her voice carrying the weight of a pronouncement that would reshape the trajectory of the entire case, "that this court has ordered and received expedited investigation into the background and conduct of witness David Foster. The findings of that investigation have revealed a deeply troubling pattern of behavior, including documented incidents of aggressive conduct, multiple employment terminations under suspicious circumstances, and evidence of financial compensation in exchange for testimony in this proceeding." Richard sat rigidly in his chair, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. His face had taken on a grayish cast, and his hands trembled slightly as he shuffled papers that no longer held any significance. Beside him, looked shocked and betrayed, as if he was only now beginning to comprehend the full magnitude of what he had set in motion. "Furthermore," Judge Mitchell continued, her words falling like hammer blows on an anvil, "this court has discovered evidence that the defendant made a financial payment of $5,000 to Mr. Foster in the 2 weeks preceding this hearing. This payment was made subsequent to communications between Mr. and Mr. Foster regarding compensation for testimony. This constitutes deliberate presentation of false evidence and potential perjury." She paused, allowing the implications to settle over the courtroom like a suffocating blanket. "I am making the following findings of fact," Judge Mitchell announced, speaking with the formal precision of someone entering her words into the permanent legal record. "David Foster's testimony is hereby stricken from the record in its entirety. Mr. Foster was not a credible witness, and there is significant evidence suggesting his testimony was deliberately fabricated. The defendant, through his attorney, deliberately presented false evidence to this court. This constitutes contempt and potential criminal conduct." Sarah Felt's hand found hers beneath the table, squeezing it with an intensity that conveyed both support and encouragement. Tears were streaming down Sarah's face, tears of relief, validation, and the profound release of 18 months of accumulated fear and uncertainty. Additionally, Judge Mitchell continued, this court is referring both Mr. and Mr. Richard to the district attorney's office for investigation regarding perjury, fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud. This court is also requesting that the State Bar Association initiate disciplinary proceedings against Mr. regarding his professional conduct as an officer of the court. She then turned directly toward, and her expression was contemptuous. Mr., I have reviewed your entire case with fresh eyes in light of these new findings. I have found your credibility to be fundamentally compromised. Your testimony regarding the defendant's supposed unfitness as a parent is now viewed through the lens of someone who was willing to fabricate evidence and suborn perjury. This court finds no merit in your claims. The gavel came down once, the sound echoing through the courtroom like thunder. Regarding custody, Judge Mitchell announced, this court awards primary physical and legal custody of Emma to the plaintiff, Sarah. The defendant is restricted to supervised visitation only, to be scheduled through the county's supervised visitation center. The defendant is ordered to pay child support in the amount of $2,000 per month, commencing immediately. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. She couldn't quite process what she was hearing. It was as if the judge's words were reaching her ears but not fully translating into comprehensible language. Squeezed her hand again, and she heard her attorney whisper, "You won, Sarah. You won." Furthermore, Judge Mitchell continued, this court is recommending that the defendant undergo psychological evaluation and anger management counseling as a condition of any future modification of custody arrangements. This court finds that Mr.'s willingness to employ deception and potentially coercive tactics in family matters is indicative of patterns that could constitute emotional abuse. She looked directly at Emma, and her stern expression softened almost imperceptibly. The minor child in this case will remain in the primary care of her mother, who has demonstrated consistent, loving, and appropriate parental care. This child's safety and are the paramount concern of this court, and there is absolutely no evidence that her mother is anything other than a devoted and competent parent. Then, in a move that surprised everyone present, Judge Mitchell addressed Officer directly. "Officer, would you please bring K9 Max forward?" Clearly confused but obedient, led K9 Max to the front of the courtroom. The dog's presence seemed to further emphasize the extraordinary nature of what had just occurred. "Let the record reflect," Judge Mitchell said, "that this court acknowledges the significance of K9 Max's alert response during this proceeding. While that response cannot serve as legal evidence in the conventional sense, it prompted investigation that revealed the truth. Sometimes, the court has learned, justice requires us to listen to voices we would normally discount, whether those voices belong to dogs or to children. This court commends Officer for his professionalism and for the integrity he demonstrated in reporting what he had observed." She then looked toward Emma, and though her expression remained judicial and controlled, there was something almost tender in her gaze. And this court particularly commends the minor child, Emma, for her instinctive response to deception. This child, at 3 years old, perceived something that adults in this courtroom initially missed. This court finds that children often possess intuitive wisdom that we, as adults bound by legal convention and professional protocol, sometimes fail to recognize. The courtroom was completely silent. Even the sounds of the air conditioning and the ambient city noise outside seemed to have faded away. "I want the record to clearly reflect," Judge Mitchell continued, her words resonating with the weight of judicial pronouncement, "that in this case, justice was served not through the presentation of traditional legal evidence, but through the intersection of a trained animal's behavioral alerting system and a young child's instinctive recognition of predatory behavior." This case will serve as a reminder to this court, and I hope, to the broader legal community, that the pursuit of truth sometimes requires us to expand our understanding of what constitutes evidence and wisdom. She banged the gavel once more. This proceeding is concluded. Sarah is awarded full custody of Emma, effective immediately. Mr. The sanctions I referenced will be transmitted to your office in writing. Court is adjourned. As the bailiff called out, "All rise," Sarah found herself unable to stand. She was shaking too violently, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the victory, by the validation of everything she had fought for, by the simple fact that it was over. Emma, sensing her mother's emotional intensity, wrapped her small arms around Sarah's neck and held on tightly. Helped Sarah to her feet, embracing her client with genuine warmth. "I told you," she whispered. "I told you we would win, and we did." Across the courtroom, Officer was making his way towards Sarah, K9 Max walking calmly beside him. When they reached Sarah, extended his hand, and his expression was warm and genuinely pleased. "You did the right thing bringing her today," he said, gesturing toward Emma. She knew the truth when she saw it. Sometimes the best evidence is the most honest response. Sarah shook his hand, tears still streaming down her face. She reached down to gently stroke K9 Max's head, and the dog responded by leaning into her hand, his tongue flicking out briefly in a gesture that seemed almost congratulatory. Behind them was being escorted from the courtroom by court officers, his head down, his earlier confidence completely shattered. Richard was furiously gathering his papers, his face flushed with humiliation and rage at how thoroughly he had been outmaneuvered, not by superior legal argument, but by the convergence of a dog's behavioral training and a child's innocent truth-telling. Sarah looked down at Emma, who was watching the proceedings with the simple confusion of a 3-year-old, who didn't fully understand what had happened but who understood, on some fundamental level, that her mother was no longer afraid. "We're going home, baby," Sarah whispered, kissing the top of her daughter's head. "We're going home, and everything is going to be okay now." For the first time in 18 months, Sarah believed those words with absolute certainty. 6 months had passed since that transformative day in Judge Mitchell's courtroom. The story of Emma and K9 Max had begun quietly, circulating through legal circles like whispered rumors of something extraordinary. But then, gradually and then with increasing momentum, the narrative had captured the attention of the broader media landscape. It started with a small piece in the local newspaper, 3-year-old's instinct uncovers courthouse fraud, written by a curious journalist who had happened to be in the courtroom that day. The article was picked up by legal news outlets, then by mainstream media, and then by the human interest segments of major television networks. By the time the story reached national prominence, it had been refined and amplified into something almost mythical. "Child's intuition saves family in landmark custody case," the headlines proclaimed. Major news networks sent reporters to conduct interviews with Sarah, who had reluctantly agreed to share her story publicly, believing that other families deserved to know that justice could emerge from the most unexpected sources. Officer and K9 Max became minor celebrities, featured in news segments, and invited to speak at various conferences and public events. The story resonated deeply with audiences because it spoke to universal human experiences, the vulnerability of motherhood, the malleability of truth in legal systems, and the profound wisdom that existed in places society often overlooked. Sarah's life had transformed in ways both wonderful and overwhelming. She had written an op-ed for a major national newspaper, titled "Listening to the Whispers: Why We Must Trust Our Children," in which she discussed the importance of cultivating children's intuitive abilities rather than training them out of existence. The piece had gone viral, generating thousands of shares and comments. Universities had reached out requesting that she speak to their law schools about her experience. Parenting organizations had invited her to participate in panel discussions about recognizing and respecting children's perceptions. But perhaps most significantly, Judge Mitchell had become an advocate for institutional reform. She had proposed a comprehensive initiative to expand the courthouse comfort animal program throughout the state. What had begun as a single program in Hamilton County had, by the 6-month mark, been implemented in 15 additional counties across 3 different states. The expansion had been rapid and enthusiastic, with court administrators across the nation recognizing the profound impact that the presence of trained comfort animals could have on courtroom proceedings, witness testimony, and the overall humanization of legal proceedings. The program had been expanded to include not just dogs, but also trained rabbits, cats, and in one particularly innovative case, a miniature horse named Princess, who had successfully provided comfort to multiple witnesses in a sexual assault trial. K9 Max, as the original animal in the expanded program, had become something of a poster child for the initiative. Officer had received multiple job offers from larger police departments and court systems interested in establishing similar programs. He had declined them all, choosing to remain in his home city where he and Max could continue their work at the grassroots level. The legal consequences for, and Richard had been severe and far-reaching, had been found guilty of perjury and fraud in both family court and criminal court. He was ordered to pay additional penalties beyond the child support requirement. His professional reputation in the financial sector had been destroyed. Few colleagues wanted to associate with him, and he had eventually been forced to relocate to another state to find employment. Richard had faced even harsher consequences. The State Bar Association had launched a formal investigation into his conduct, ultimately resulting in a 6-month suspension from practicing law. He had been required to attend ethics training and undergo his own psychological evaluation. His law firm had distanced itself from him, and several of his other clients had sought new representation, concerned that his willingness to suborn perjury might extend to their cases. David Foster had faced criminal charges as well. His pattern of aggressive behavior and intimidation had finally resulted in legal consequences. He had been convicted of fraud and was serving a 2-year sentence in the state correctional system. Investigations into his background had revealed that he had been engaged in similar schemes with multiple other individuals, and additional charges were being prepared. But the impact of the case extended far beyond individual legal consequences. In law schools across the country, professors had begun incorporating the V case into their curricula. It was taught in courses on family law, evidence, professional responsibility, and judicial ethics. The case became a teaching moment about the limitations of traditional legal proceedings, about the importance of thorough investigation, and about the value of listening to unconventional perspectives. One particularly moving development occurred when a major legal journal published an article analyzing the case with the title Beyond Evidence: How Intuition and Training Converge to Reveal Truth. The author, a prominent legal scholar, argued that the case represented a paradigm shift in how the legal system should conceptualize evidence and truth. The article suggested that perhaps society had been too rigid in its definitions, too restrictive in what it was willing to recognize as valid indicators of reality. Sarah had established a nonprofit organization called the Emma Project, dedicated to supporting families in custody disputes and to educating the public about children's intuitive capabilities. The organization provided legal resources, emotional support, and advocacy for mothers and children navigating the family court system. In its first year alone, the Emma Project had assisted over 200 families and had generated significant media attention for custody cases involving false allegations and fraudulent testimony. Emma herself, now approaching her 4th birthday, remained blissfully unaware of the magnitude of her impact on the world. She had continued to thrive emotionally and developmentally under her mother's primary care. Her relationship with her father was now conducted entirely through supervised visitation at the county's supervised visitation center, with a neutral third party present to ensure appropriate behavior and boundaries. Had eventually requested that the supervision be discontinued, and Judge Mitchell had agreed, but only on the condition that undergo completed psychological counseling and anger management training. The visits remained infrequent and somewhat strained, but Emma seemed to accept them as simply another part of her life, without the emotional turmoil that had previously plagued her. Most remarkably, Emma had developed a special bond with K9 Max. Sarah had arranged for Emma to participate in a volunteer program at the local police department where she could spend time with Officer and the dog. K9 Max, for his part, seemed to have a particular affection for Emma. When she approached him, his entire demeanor would soften. He would gently rest his head on her small shoulders and remain perfectly still, as if he understood, on some profound level, that this small human had changed both of their lives forever. Judge Mitchell had retired from the bench 2 years later, but not before authoring a comprehensive proposal for nationwide reform of courtroom procedures regarding vulnerable witnesses and the integration of evidence beyond traditional testimony. Her legacy in the judiciary was secured, but she often reflected that it was a 3-year-old girl and a German shepherd that had truly taught her the most important lesson of her career: that justice sometimes whispers through the smallest voices, and the system must be patient and wise enough to listen. The story of Emma became legendary in legal circles, in parenting communities, and in animal training organizations. It was a story about courage, intuition, corruption, and redemption. It was a story that reminded people that sometimes the truth doesn't emerge through power and authority, but through the convergence of love, innocence, and the profound wisdom that exists in unexpected places, in the instincts of a child, in the training of an animal, and in the willingness of one judge to look beyond conventional procedure to find actual justice. Years later, when Emma was old enough to understand what had happened in that courtroom, she would learn that she had fundamentally changed the legal system. She had helped reform how courts treated vulnerable witnesses. She had inspired the expansion of comfort animal programs across the nation. She had demonstrated that children's voices matter, that their perceptions deserved respect, and that sometimes the smallest among us possess the greatest wisdom. But most importantly, Emma had learned that speaking the truth, no matter how unconventional or unusual that truth-telling might be, could change everything, and that lesson would guide her throughout her life.